Either more from an admissions standpoint, I'd be happy to talk from an admission standpoint about some of the things that our committee and our process is really valuing, really looking for, or I'd be happy to focus more on particular aspects of the educational program, the curriculum, the geographic setup of the campuses, the clerkship. So some of those things too, depending upon the audience, sometimes are a little bit more salient. So I'll try my best to be broad, but please do feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'd be more than happy to pause and kind of take stock of a particular set of questions, certainly. So I'll start by talking maybe just a little bit about some of the academics and some of the admissions related metrics that are really valuable to us as an institution. We matriculate a class of 300 students every year. And so about 2/3 of our students will come from the state of Michigan. About 1/3 of our students will be from out of state, which will be inclusive of a handful of international students, some Canadian students, and then a fairly large population of domestic US students from out of state. So geographically, and I think demographically, we have quite a mix of students in our class. And so certainly for any of you that are not Michigan residents, if you're a Purdue student, you're an Indiana resident, we certainly matriculate a lot of Purdue students each year. And so I always like to be upfront about this particular aspect of our class composition, because I think it's valuable to know when you're thinking about a strategy too, about which medical schools to apply. You've obviously got in the state of Indiana, at the very least, one in-state public medical school option. You've got a couple of other choices, and you certainly got one DO choice in state as well too, as a private institution. But really, consider applying to schools in Michigan, and certainly consider applying to MSU-Com, because we really do take a number of Indiana students every year. We take a number of Purdue students every year, and we really are very intentionally building a lot of that geographic diversity into our class. So we're not a school that takes a very, very small sliver of our students from out of state. We are definitely taking a very substantial proportion of our students from out of state. In terms of the typical sort of median academic performance, these numbers are more or less, what our committee has looked for in the past. Over the past couple of years, we've seen this really more towards the higher end. So the median GPA for science GPA has been right around a 3.7 or just a little bit under that. And our median MCAT has been somewhere in that 507, 508, occasionally more like a 509 type of range. So generally speaking, our committee is focused on making sure students have strong academic preparation in the sciences. And certainly with respect to MCAT, usually that median MCAT for the class is right along the break point between the upper third and the middle third of test takers. So while we certainly accept a pretty broad range of MCAT scores, just like most medical schools do, that I think can oftentimes help students coordinate in terms of understanding, sort of what the average kind of profile looks like. I would also suggest that in contradistinction to just looking at academic measurements, our committee and our process is really focused, I think, co-equally on what we might call non-cognitive domains of skill acquisition, or these types of non-cognitive or non-academic accomplishments. So our process is very much focused on understanding the types of exposure you've had to medicine, the types of hands-on experiences or clinical skill development opportunities that you've had. We're interested in your orientation towards service and leadership activities in your communities, however you see that role, however that's salient and shows up to you. And unsurprisingly, we're very interested in what you know about osteopathic medicine as a distinct professional pathway, as a distinct professional identity, as a unique philosophy of patient care. And so we're looking for people that find resonance with the institution along these particular types of dimensions. But I really can't emphasize enough that these are really two kind of co-equal domains. Our faculty and our admissions committee are very much committed to the idea that holistically, we want to really co-equally value a lot of the academic performance with some of this non-academic or non-cognitive area as well too. So this is all very, very important to understand in terms of putting together a strategy for when you apply to medical school, but really understanding what it is that schools are going to be valuing. On the previous slide, I had our mission and vision, and I think being aligned with that is really important, but it's definitely worthwhile to look at what we've got, what we've got here as we express the values of the institution and what gets explicitly sort of measured or explicitly valued in our process. So I mentioned that we matriculate a class of 300 students every year. We will divide those students among 3 different pre-clerkship sites in the state of Michigan. And it's important to understand that while we have these 3 different pre-clerkship sites, they're not distinct campuses in the sense that these are independent programs. It's one MSU College of Osteopathic Medicine, but we have 3 different locations. And yes, they're distributed a little bit across the state, but they're really, in the scheme of things, not that far apart from one another. 2/3 of our students will be in East Lansing. This is East Street Hall. This is the main educational space for our osteopathic medical students on the main MSU campus. So this is where the majority of our students will end up being. The other third of our class is split between our 2 Southeast Michigan pre-clerkship sites. So about half of the students, so about 50, will go to the Macomb site, which is on the Macomb Community College campus, right next to the Henry Ford Hospital. The other half, or about 50 students, will be at the Detroit Medical Center, which is in Midtown Detroit. So I think that there's a couple of interesting advantages that this setup really gives the college. One is that with the diversity of locations, and as students are admitted every year to the class, they get to choose a pre-clerkship site on a first come, first served basis. And so, of course, some sites will fill up a little bit more quickly than others. Conventionally, Detroit consistently every year is the most popular choice, and that will always fill up the most quickly. Usually fills up sort of by the early winter. And then we have to go to a waiting list at that point for that particular site. But I think that there's some interesting advantages to the way that we have this set up. For the most part, one of the big questions you'll have to ask yourself when you're choosing a medical school to attend is, not just where you want to be, which is important, but also what size institution you want to be at. We take a lot of pride in being the largest medical school in the state of Michigan. The dean likes to call us Michigan's medical school. We provide more physicians for the state of Michigan than any other medical school. We have more active living alumni, I believe, than any other Michigan medical school does. And so the breadth of that influence is very, very important to us. But of course, the size and scale of that operation, gives us some unique opportunities and some unique advantages. And one thing that you'll have to consider when you decide where you want to go to medical school is if you want to be at a larger institution or you want to be at a smaller institution. And oftentimes the advantages of either of those types of operations would be mutually exclusive. If you go to a big school, you get all the advantages of going to a big school, but sometimes it lacks some of the intimacy of being part of a smaller cohort. We really provide our students, I think, a unique opportunity to marry both of the advantages of a smaller cohort experience, if that's something they like, with all of the resources that are leveraged in support of a body of about 1,200 medical students across all 4 years. So as you can imagine, the college mobilizes really pretty tremendous and varied resources in support of the educational, research, and other programmatic and outreach efforts of the college. And so students can take advantage of being part of both a very large organization and also being part of a more tight-knit or small community, if that's something that feels important, if that's something that feels more comfortable. And so, in East Lansing, we're going to have about 400 students across the first 2 years, but it'll be much, much smaller than that in either Macomb or Detroit. So it's a total pre-clerkship student population of about 100 students across year 1 and year 2. So I think that that's kind of a special opportunity that we can provide our students in terms of some of the unique advantages of how we organize the pre-clerkship curriculum. And as I mentioned too, the sites really aren't that far apart. Macomb and Detroit are, depending on traffic, of course, not that far apart. I think they're about 30 miles apart. And of course, it's probably close to 90 minutes from East Lansing to Detroit or to Macomb. But in the scheme of things, there's still a lot of interaction between the sites. I'll touch just briefly on what I see as some of the highlights for the pre-clerkship curriculum. We're in the midst of implementing sort of a new organizational model that will begin with the class of 2027. So that's the group that's matriculating this year that will be beginning in July this summer. So we have reorganized our curriculum such that we're going to be able to have a later start date. So we last year and years prior to last year were able to, well, I shouldn't say able to, in the recent past, we had a curriculum that began, generally speaking, in early June, which was, to say the very least, not a popular time for medical students to be beginning their medical education. So we were really challenged to try to come up with a way to reorganize the curriculum such that we could have a more conventional start time. So we now have, this year, our first week of required attendance will be July 10. So we have about a midsummer start. So that puts us closer into alignment with a lot of the other Michigan medical schools. So we now have a 6-semester organization for our pre-clerkship curriculum. There's a foundational segment in this first block. The summer semester in the beginning is still fundamentally unchanged. It's a 5-week semester. It's focused on anatomy and on biochemistry. And from there, students will move on into systems-related courses. And then there will still be a transitional period in semester 6 that will allow students to have some time to move from the pre-clerkship curriculum into the clerkship curriculum and pass board exams and some of those important milestones that they need to take care of before progressing further in the curriculum. I'm often asked if there's a specific curricular philosophy that applies broadly to our curriculum. And I will share that this is not a curriculum that is explicitly and wholly aligned or organized around a particular model like team-based learning, problem-based learning, case-based learning. All of those different types of methods are utilized in different course segments, or they're utilized in different individual lectures or educational activities. And there's a lot of implementation of other kinds of flipped classroom methodologies and teaching methodologies as well too. But overall, I would share that this is probably a fairly traditional approach to curriculum presentation. This isn't a curriculum that is explicitly organized around one of those other methodologies that sometimes medical schools really want to highlight as sort of a unique approach to teaching and learning. So the way our faculty approach teaching and the pre-clerkship curriculum particularly is very varied and very diverse, but it isn't necessarily going to be organized around small group learning in 100% of cases, or team-based learning, where, as you might imagine, for a class of 300, probably would be a more challenging thing to implement. TBL, generally speaking, you're bringing the entire cohort of students together in one location. So that's also something that I would share in terms of the style of presentation of some of the material. There's still lectures. Some of them are recorded. Some activities are mandatory in person. Some are optional. Some are synchronous. Some are asynchronous. And a lot of that would align with your intuitions. So obviously anatomy activities where you're in the laboratory, those are going to be mandatory in-person activities, but there's flexibility around the way you engage with a lot of the other elements in the curriculum. There's a lot of opportunities in the pre-clerkship curriculum for students to get exposure to clinical environments or to build clinical hands-on skills. Our street medicine teams are still, I think, probably one of the biggest and most interesting draws. So there's a street medicine program at each of our pre-clerkship sites. So no matter which of the sites you're at, you're going to have the opportunity to provide care and provide volunteer service to the community that you're a part of. So obviously those communities will be a little bit different. The community that is served by the Macomb students is inflected somewhat differently from the Detroit site or from the Lansing area site, but all students will have the opportunity to engage in this particular way. And so I think that this particularly is a big draw for our students. The other thing that's a substantial draw, and I know gets a lot of interest in our process every year, are the outreach and study abroad electives that we offer in conjunction with the Institute for Global Health at MSU. So I would encourage you, if you're at all interested in this, go to the MSU website, search for the Institute for Global Health. They have a lot more detail on their website in terms of the study abroad programs, including some really nice photos and videos that kind of highlight what a lot of these different study abroad opportunities are. There's also the opportunity, I don't have a slide for it here, but there is also the opportunity to get a master's in global health. It's a one-year degree through the IGH while you're completing your osteopathic medical education as well too. So IGH provides a lot of different sort of varied educational opportunities for our students. And you're going to find that there's opportunities for these types of annual medical electives in your first year, all the way through your fourth year. So this is really a resource that students can engage with throughout their entire medical education. So it's not just a narrow window of opportunity for students. And we tend to have a high degree of participation among our medical students. When it comes to student life, I always like to try to defer to our students. And so, perhaps some other time, I could have our medical students kind of present and talk a little bit about their experience. But obviously at MSU Com, there's all the conventional ways for students to get involved. I do like to highlight too that in terms of student organizations and student leadership, that we're very intentional about making sure that organizations have leadership among our students across all of our pre-clerkship sites. So you don't have to be an East Lansing-based student if being involved or having a leadership role in student organizations is something that's important to you. There are two broad kind of areas of student resources that I really like to highlight to different audiences. Our academic and career advising team provides a lot of the support that you would expect in terms of academic support to our students, especially in the pre-clerkship curriculum. But beyond that, they do a large range of career preparation and career advising services. So they're there to help students meet all of those different transitions that they're going to navigate throughout the entirety of their medical education. From the very beginning, when you're trying to figure out that transition from being an undergraduate or even a graduate student and navigating what it means to become a professional student and what some of the unique challenges and difficulties and opportunities are with respect to that. They're there to help with board exam preparation, whether it's COMLEX Level 1 and USMLE Step 1, if you elect to take that, COMLEX Level 2, some of those other types of elements as well. And they're there to help students navigate transition to clerkship. And then from there, formulate a plan for the fourth year of medical school, decide on electives, help with specialty selection, and then navigate the match process as well too. So they really provide a lot of support to our students in terms of the kinds of academic but also career related resources that students really need in order to get to grips with their professional education and ultimately be successful. The Wellness and Counseling Office, they do a lot of the wellness and mental well-being activities that you would expect from this kind of a team. But I think what's important to understand about this is that these are additional resources our college provides to make sure that this personal dimension of student wellness is really supported in a way that I think is above and beyond what a lot of other institutions are able to provide. So all of our students, by virtue of being professional students at Michigan State, are entitled to utilize the services at Counseling and Psychological Services, but we also have additional mental health counselors that are available at each of the pre-clerkship sites. So these are services we offer to our students for personal counseling that are above and beyond and in addition to what the university already provides. So I think that between these two dimensions, I like to mention both of these assets because I think they really communicate to people how seriously both the academic and professional, but also the personal well-being of our students really is and how much we want to make sure that students are co-equally supported in both of these domains. I'm not going to touch too deeply on this slide and the next slide. I'll talk about the DO PhD and then the DO MBA really quick. But these are the two dual degree programs that we have at the college that are both fairly popular programs. So really, if anybody has any questions about either of them, feel free to email our office. I'd be happy to chat more, or have a representative from either of those programs answer some more specific questions. The DO PhD program, I think, is salient in a general sense because I think it should signal to applicants or future students that we have a really extensive body of research opportunities that are available to our students. So no matter what it is that you're interested in doing, you're going to find that there are really tremendous research opportunities, whether that's more in bench science and foundational science research, or if you're interested in clinical projects or translational research. There are an abundance of opportunities for our students to get involved really at all stages of their medical education. Likewise, we have a dual degree with the DO MBA program, so in conjunction with the Broad College of Business. So we have an opportunity for students to complete both degrees in 5 years. And the DO PhD, if you're interested in DO PhD, that's something to really think hard about before you apply, especially for our dual degree physician scientist training program. We really would prefer that students identify that interest up front. It tends to be a program that's less flexible in terms of the way in which you progress through both degrees. It's an 8-year commitment in most cases. Students very rarely are able to make sufficient progress to completing those degrees in a shorter time frame. But with the DO MBA, there's a lot more flexibility. So oftentimes students will not decide that they're interested in the MBA until their first or even second year of medical school. So this is a little bit more flexible in terms of when you have that intensive year of the MBA coursework that's separate from the DO coursework. So that's kind of a brief summary of some of what I see as the highlights of the first 2 years or the pre-clerkship curriculum. I'll talk a little bit just very briefly about third year in the clerkship. So you can see kind of a representation here in Michigan of what our statewide campus system looks like. And these are really the network that supports our base hospital locations for students. So in your second year, you will rank order your base hospital choices. You'll actually have a opportunity to go to a base hospital expo and get a chance to meet with representatives from each of the base hospitals, as well as student liaisons from each of the base hospitals, and then kind of formulate a list of your choices from number one. I think we have 24 particular sites. It's more than 24 hospitals, but it's 24 particular sites that students rank. And then there's a matching algorithm that essentially matches students up at that point. And then students can swap if they so choose at that point. It's important to know that your base hospital location for third year is not impacted by your pre-clerkship site. So it's not like if you're a student at Detroit, you get the first choice for Detroit area hospitals. These processes are 100% separate in that sense. So choose a pre-clerkship site based on the location and the size that sounds comfortable or interesting to you, and know that you don't get penalized or enhanced in any particular way when it comes to the base hospital selection. I think the strength of this network is really one of the unique assets of the college. As we note here, our statewide campus system is a rather extraordinarily sized resource in terms of being a consortium of GME-related resources. So these are all of the residency, internship, fellowship programs that are affiliated with the College of Osteopathic Medicine. So it's a really unique opportunity for our students to meet program directors and faculty, explore programs, explore specialties, and learn quite a bit. You'll also have, I think, somewhat uniquely in the third year, 2 elective opportunities, which doesn't always work out that way depending upon the organization of a particular school's clerkship curriculum. So there's 2 elective opportunities, I believe of 4 or 5 weeks each in your third year. And then once you get to your fourth year, that's really where academic and career advising comes in, and they're really able to help you formulate a more specific plan, which is really going to be focused on potentially some away electives. So you can absolutely be a visiting student at other medical schools across the United States or even internationally. We have students do that every year. So there's really a broad diversity of these types of clinical education resources for our students. I don't have a slide that I've made yet for this year's most recent match for the class of 2023. So I'll still share class of 2022. But this is representative of what we see really in a very, very typical year. So really the overwhelming majority of our students match every year. And I think that, you know, really for the overwhelming majority of medical schools, they're matching all of their students very successfully at or above sort of the national average. And so in general, I think it's, you know, sometimes people say, oh, it's like a 99% match rate. Is that anything to worry about? No, it's definitely not. You know, a lot of times students, you know, for personal, idiosyncratic, health-related reasons, maybe they want to do a year of research in preparation for re-entering the match to try to prepare themselves for a more competitive specialty selection, something like that. There's all kinds of individual reasons why somebody may not match. So it's not necessarily indicative of a really important signal for students to understand. So generally speaking, you know, unless a school is really matching like a very small number of their students for some reason or a very low percentage, I don't think that, you know, a match rate that deviates from, you know, 99 or 100% is anything for individuals to really have any real concern about. And then the specialties that are represented here are pretty representative of what we see most years. You know, I always caution people about using match lists in a predictive sense in terms of, well, if I really want to be, I don't know, you know, physical medicine and rehabilitation specialist, like, you know, should I go here? Should I go somewhere else? I think it's really hard to use match data in that particular way, if for no other reason than this represents the interests of about 300 individuals. And so that group of 300 is going to change and it's going to look a little bit different every year. And some specialties will be more popular some years, some will be less popular in other years. So I think when you're evaluating schools and you're evaluating some of these outcomes and the career-related data that they have, it's really valuable to look for a diversity of outcomes, which is something that I think is typically featured in all of the graduating classes that we have. We always see a wide breadth of outcomes. And so a little bit more on sort of that specific data from last year. I will say that the class of 2023 data is basically the same as this. It really hasn't changed. So like most years, about half of our students go into primary care. So about half go into surgical or other types of specialty areas. We usually have about half of our students go into one of our statewide campus system residency programs. Typically about another 25% of our class will stay in the state of Michigan, but will be at a residency program that is not affiliated with the college. And then that means that we have about a quarter of our students, you know, so you can see kind of the distribution here, about a quarter of our students will go out of state somewhere else. So that's a little bit about some of the diversity of outcomes that we have there as well too. So certainly I think the breadth of outcomes is really nice to see here as well too. So lots of students doing primary care, lots of students doing other things, students going into our programs, which we're always excited to see, but really the ability for us to also have our students go out and, you know, sort of share the strengths that we were able to provide them in their medical education at MSU. And sort of, you know, be great ambassadors for the college within the state and further beyond is a really nice outcome for us as well too. So that's mostly it. Here's our contact info. Anybody would be welcome to find us on the web, reach out to us by email. Certainly before you apply, we'd be happy to provide some specific sort of guidance in a lot of cases too. All that information is available on the web. So yeah, that's it. At this point, if there's any other questions, I'd be more than happy to take those.
I have a question. Do you
Yeah,
mind
sure.
kind of telling us what makes a strong applicant for MSU specifically, or things that you guys know you're looking for that you may think other schools aren't looking for necessarily?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a really natural question. I'd say that for the most part, I think people don't believe me when I say this, but this is the single best piece of advice that I can give you when you're applying to Michigan State College of Osteopathic Medicine. You're going to fill out the AACOMAS application. It's really important that your AACOMAS application not be a carbon copy of your AMCAS application for MD schools. I know that the personal statements are the same length. They're both 5,300 characters. And so there's probably a lot of temptation there to say, like, oh, I've got a solid personal statement that I'm happy with. I'm just going to copy paste that over. But this application services are distinct, and MD schools and DO schools see themselves a little bit differently in terms of their philosophy and in terms of the way that they want to emphasize certain principles or values in their education. So it's really, really valuable if you talk about what exposure you've had to osteopathic medicine in your AACOMAS application, or even if you just mention something in your personal statement about ways in which you've engaged with osteopathic physicians or ways in which you've been exposed to osteopathic physicians, like maybe you scribed for one, or maybe there's a practice that you were a medical assistant in and you got to interact with DOs, and maybe what you've learned. The ways in which you can really highlight what you know about DOs, about osteopathic medicine, or if you haven't had that opportunity, I think for the most part, we have a strong expectation for Michigan applicants because there's so many DOs in the state of Michigan that they will have engaged in some way. Certainly if they're an MSU undergraduate, I think that's a strong expectation for us. And we know that's not the case out of state. But even if you just talk about osteopathic principles or some of these other elements, things that you find resonant with your values, with your philosophy, your motivations for wanting to practice medicine or your reasons for wanting to be a physician, all of that is really, really useful because I'll be very honest, the overwhelming majority of people do not do that. So if you do that, that's already a positive differentiator in your application. So it sounds like a really simple thing. And that's why I say nobody believes me when I say this is a really key, useful thing to do, because it sounds so simple. But it's oftentimes the simple things that I think get forgotten. So if you can really emphasize that, I think that that's what's key. The other things that are important to understand, of course, we're a community-based medical school. So the kinds of things that from a pre-professional standpoint, our process really values. Like I mentioned in the beginning, we're really focused on service and community involvement. So those types of things are extremely important to our identity as an institution. And then also having some hands-on clinical engagement, whether that's employment, which is always great, or if you worked as an EMT or first responder, or medical assistant, phlebotomist, hospice worker, any of those things, those are really, really great. And those are probably fairly non-negotiable activities in terms of things that our committee is really looking for. And really that pre-professional dimension is so important because we want you to be ready to be engaged and present and hands-on in your education. So that pre-professional dimension, in addition to that osteopathic specificity, really, really key and really, really valuable. It's really, really, really worth emphasizing in your application. So I really do believe that that is absolutely co-equal in importance with some of the academic measurements. So yes, it's important that you got the best grades that you could, that you took a challenging and solidly preparatory course load and so on. But really, we're balancing a lot of the academics with some of those other developmental activities. And so that's one of the reasons that we have such a range of GPAs and MCATs in the class, is because people will sort of approach that balance sometimes in somewhat different ways. Any other questions? That was a good question, and I think something that is worth emphasizing, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, that was good advice. I guess kind of related, I know there's always a debate between, MD versus DO. In your opinion, what are some ways you see DO physicians practice differently than MDs? I guess if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does.
What are the benefits of a DO degree versus MD?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's I'll be very honest that even as an admissions officer, it's one of those things that in a broad sense, I probably still struggle with as much as pre-medical students or applicants to medical school. In a lot of ways, it can be really hard to disambiguate. It's one residency system. All physicians go through the same graduate medical education training. They all have access to the same specialties. DOs practice in every specialty. And so even though maybe historically there might have been a greater proportion of DOs in primary care, that's not really necessarily the case. I'd actually have to like look up some AMA data or something like that to see if there really is, you know, a difference there. But I somehow doubt that that's a continuing trend that will continue to move on as individuals your age and beyond, you know, move into their careers in medicine. So I think sometimes it's hard to make a broad, high level sort of 30,000 foot distinction between, you know, what is an MD approach to being a physician versus what is a DO approach. I do think it can be really valuable to look at particular schools. And so as I emphasized, I think the way the DO philosophy and the way that identity of what it means to be a DO is really salient at MSU is it really informs what it means to be a DO who's a graduate of MSU Comm. It means that we're focused on service. It means that we're focused on osteopathic principles and practice. So I think that a lot of times we're looking for individuals that seem like they get us and we're going to get them, and that they are going to be institutional partners in alignment with what the longer term goals of the vision and the mission of the college are, to provide service to communities of need. So a lot of times I don't think that there's necessarily a kind of a hard and fast distinction that we can really make between MD schools and DO schools. But I do think that there are some interesting distinctions, maybe at the school by school kind of level. Being at a community-based medical school like MSU Comm is obviously different in some ways from being at a large sort of research-focused institution, or where there's, you know, sort of an academic medical center kind of a presence. So again, I think that is sort of osteopathic in its own way. There's something about that type of engagement or that style. Doesn't mean that we don't have research going on. It doesn't mean that we don't have all of our students and faculty engaged in that way. But it is going to be a different style. Like the way service and engagement with the community is going to inform that. It will be a little bit different. So those would be some considerations, certainly. I always encourage people, you know, especially, you know, I don't know necessarily as well for Indiana residents, oftentimes like what the strategy of applying to medical schools is or should be. And frankly, it varies so much state by state. You know, some states have a lot of medical schools, like Michigan and Ohio. The students who live in those states are sort of uniquely blessed. And then there's states where there are zero medical schools or zero public medical schools. And so those students will sort of automatically be disadvantaged in sort of a unique or an interesting way at that point. But definitely, as you're putting together a school list, I think it really is valuable to apply to a mix of DO and MD institutions. I mean, obviously, there's advantages and disadvantages there in terms of the time and the investment, like obviously with separate application services and reduplicating a lot of work in terms of sending transcripts. I understand the hassle of all of that, certainly, and the cost associated with it. So, you know, think pragmatically about it, of course, but I do think that both MD and DO institutions have a lot to offer, but it's really worth drilling down and kind of looking at that school specific level, I think, in a lot of cases. Certainly don't want to put anybody on the spot, but yeah, I'm happy to answer other questions, or if there's no other questions, that's totally fine too. So we're easy to find. If you do want to reach out to us and ask us anything in the future, we'd be, yeah, happy to get an email or a phone call, certainly.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, that was a great talk, very informative, and the slides will be sent out, so anyone who has questions can email you separately. But yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to do it. I didn't get to visit Purdue this year with the Health Professions Fair with somebody else from my team, but I have a lot of affection for Purdue. It's always one of my favorite places to visit. So hope everything's good in West Lafayette, and hope spring is around the corner for you guys.
Yes, you too.
Thanks so
right.
much.
You're very welcome. Have a good evening, everybody. Take care.